Rachmaninoff wrote lots of notes. In fact, scientists estimate that the total number of notes across all of Rachmaninoff's piano concertos is more than the number of grains of sand on all of the beaches on Earth combined. Yet somehow, the one passage in all of Rachmaninoff's concertos that pianists mess up in performance more than any other is so easy.
You could do it at the end of first-year piano study. You could play a passage from Rachmaninoff.
See, look, I'm sitting here playing this one-handed while filming with the other, and I'm talking to you at the same time. What is it about this single line of gently undulating triplets in Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto that confuses so many veteran concert pianists, including some of the greatest pianists who have ever lived, including, no, et tu, Sergei? In this video, we're going to get to the bottom of this paradox, looking at memory slips in this section from several live Rock 2 performances, and breaking down the notes in question so we can understand better how Rachmaninoff set traps for unsuspecting pianists. Pianists like this one.
I mean, I didn't learn it wrong, and I don't usually play it wrong, but, I screwed up.
Now, I understand that memory slips and missed notes are a big taboo subject for concert pianists, and it might seem cruel to be exposing real pianists' mistakes. But missing notes is just a part of music making, and memory slips happen to every classical pianist, from average ones like me to the most celebrated concert pianists in history. At the same time, I understand the potential embarrassment that many pianists would feel if their memory slips were exposed in this way, especially if they have more to lose. So my rule is this: I'll only reveal the identities of major concert pianists whose reputations are in no way threatened by fumbling a few notes one time. My name is Ben Laude, and I'm actually in the middle of preparing to perform Rock 2 with orchestra in just a few weeks. I'm in that make sure you don't screw anything up too badly phase of practicing. And my first order of business is to master this seemingly innocuous passage that has claimed so many victims over the years. So first, let's look at that passage in context. We're in the third movement in a bridge passage that keeps you in suspense after the second theme.
After the gorgeous lyric second theme, da 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 da, which ends sort of in a puff of magic and ends on the wrong chords. It's like, what's happening now?
What happens is the movement's march-like first theme is transformed into these otherworldly, noodling triplets.
Rachmaninoff indulges one of his favorite things, which is Orientalism, with a flat six, vacationing down into the Caspian Sea or something.
Then, after some more Oriental noodles an octave higher, it floats up to a B-flat trill. Then all of this is repeated twice more on different harmonies.
It's kind of magical. It's suspended over a bass, and there's little percussion clicks and pizzicatos or whatever it is.
Themselves a distant echo of that same march theme that's now unfurling in the piano. Then, after rising to one final higher trill, the music snaps out of it.
The piano says, let's go. We can't, daydream about vacations very much.
And just so you can get the full passage in your ear without any mistakes, here's a 1993 VHS tape of Grigory Sokolov's fingers performing it with the Finnish Radio Symphony. Considering the length and complexity of the whole concerto, this passage seems pretty simple, right? So how is it that pianists end up bungling it so often? Well, I've identified basically two types of memory slips. Let's call the first kind of memory slip Vertigo. The pianist gets disoriented, climbing to higher and higher registers, and when they look back down, the world is spinning and they don't know where to step. Take the case of this pianist, a winner of a prestigious college concerto competition. They get through the first group of triplets just fine and make their way up to the B-flat trill, but when they look back down, instead of seeing the E-flat that begins the second group of triplets, they see the G-flat that begins the third group. And you can sort of hear that the harmonies in the orchestra are clashing a little bit with what the pianist is playing. But kudos to the pianist who keeps their composure and says, well, I just have to play this one twice and no one in the audience will notice except for my teacher. Another case of vertigo in this passage comes from celebrated pianist Andrei Gavrilov. But in his case, he gets up to the second high B-flat trill, and when he looks down, when he should have played G-flat, he plays E-flat, the beginning of the second group again. And then he corrects himself. Gavrilov's slip is actually more noticeable because he immediately tries to fix it. Whereas our first pianist basically enters a holding pattern in the wrong harmony until they have a chance to correct it. Gavrilov could have just accepted his fate. He chose E-flat instead of G-flat and realized he'll be able to transition relatively inconspicuously back from G minor to B-flat major. Instead, this. The second and more common reason for error is what I'd like to call lost in the woods.
I think it's safe to say at this point that we're lost. I don't know what to do.
All these pianists thankfully find their way out of the woods, but each takes a slightly different harmonic route. Some emerge more or less unscathed, staying on their feet and finding their way back to the trail. Others stumble a bit more and end up collecting a few bruises and scratches on their way out. So here's a few reputable pianists who required first aid upon exiting the passage. And now here's two more who chose the wrong harmonic path but otherwise escape unscathed. Now some pianists are on the right harmonic path, but they end up taking different kinds of missteps along the way. I promise I'm not trying to be petty. Yes, I'm splitting hairs, but that's what pianists do. Especially in a passage like this that's so exposed, that has so few notes, it's expected for any concert pianist not to miss a single one of them. Especially when they've aced thousands of notes that have come before it in much denser and more rapid passage work. So now these are very microscopic errors, but the next two pianists do grab some wrong notes, although they're quite logical, just different inversions of the correct harmony.
Well, it was almost all good, except in the very first one, I went to the wrong inversion of a chord. It's basically an E-flat chord with an extra note or two. And instead of starting on G, I started on E-flat.
So he's outlining the right triad, but he's not climbing quite high enough. He realizes this and immediately gets back on.
And then caught myself and went to B-flat for the end, which is correct. So it was harmonically correct. It was not melodically correct. The trouble with public performance is that the moment I played the first note wrong, G, I had to do something about it, right? I screwed up, but not very much. It was a very professional screw up, if I do say so myself.
It's possible that nobody in the auditorium was aware of it. Maybe you weren't even aware of it.
That is possible because it doesn't sound wrong. I don't know even what I thought. I mostly reacted. It was just instinct takes over at that point. I'm just happy it wasn't worse than it was, because I'm sure in my life I've done it worse than that.
Now Kocsis does something similar, also beginning on E flat, but rising all the way to G, a tenth above it, and then finding his way back to the correct path up towards the trill. What's interesting about Kocsis' mistake, it's actually the correct inversion and voicing that you get the second time this passage comes back and begins in G flat.
You know, and don't forget you have the second time through where you have 3 more chances to get little things like that wrong.
While every other little rising figure climbs in increments of an octave, just this one time in G flat it spans a tenth. And actually, I think it was this wider voicing that ends up tripping up Rachmaninoff himself when he reaches the passage. I think part of him said, wait, I'm rising too quickly. This is supposed to be over an octave higher, not a tenth higher. He was surprised by his own notes. So what makes it so hard that even the composer, probably the greatest pianist of the 20th century, actually fumbles a little bit in performance? Well, Garrick and I came up with 4 things about the passage that we think lead to all kinds of problems for pianists. Number 1, people don't practice it. I mean, seriously, it's a long, difficult piece and you have to pick your battles.
It's the only easy thing in the whole piece to play. It's so obvious that we don't practice it very much because, like, what could be the problem? There are 100, if not 200 or 500 passages in this piece which require hours of work just to be able to accomplish.
Number 2, it's hard to rely on your ear or even your muscle memory in this passage because it's so repetitive.
Oh my God, what if I miss that? Where do I go? Is this the first time or the second time?
Your ear can't save you. For example, you have 2 B flat trills, and as we saw with the Vertigo pianists, they look back down and it's not clear if you're supposed to start on an E flat or a G flat or something else. Number 3, pretty much any fingering works, and that's a problem.
I don't know if I've ever played it with the same fingering twice, and this is also what screws us up maybe, because it's like you could go in there and just do it with your nose if you wanted to. That's another reason it's easy to forget, because we often memorize through fingering.
That's right. You're right. Absolutely. For a pianist who can play the rest of the piece, there's no reason to worry about the fingering for that. You can start that passage with your thumb if you want, or the second finger, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth. It doesn't matter. You could play it upside down practically.
Here we can learn something from Nobuyuki Tsuji, the blind pianist who split the gold medal in the 2009 Clyburn. Because if you watch him play this passage, or really any passage, you see how quickly he prepares his hand position for what's coming next. And number 4, this passage is like a tightrope with no harmonic reference point to hold on to.
There's no harmonic support. I mean, the fact that it's a unison, or just, sorry, a single line actually is, you know, counterintuitively harder than when you have chords, like, you know, because each one of the notes in a chord reinforces the other in your memory. You have hand shapes, you know, so.
Exactly. Yes, that's a very good point. So my advice to pianists would be, make sure you know the harmonic structure of this thing.
So finally, I want to show you what I call the purely musical way of remembering this passage. This is the most powerful way to memorize the passage because you actually understand the logic of the notes that Rachmaninoff chose. So first of all, remember that you're in the key of E flat. This is the relative major to the tonic of C minor, and it's actually the key you're supposed to end an exposition in. Now remember that there are 3 groups of triplets that are happening in sequence in this passage. And the harmonies you need to remember for each of them actually derive from the E flat triad. build a triad on top of each of those three notes, E flat, G, and B flat. And using the notes of the key you're in, you're going to get an E flat major triad, a G minor triad, and a B flat major triad. Now, apply the following rule to each. Begin on that exotic flat 6, and this is going to help counter your vertigo, because now look down, know which triad you're on based on the E flat chord, and always start on the flat 6th of that triad, the half step right above the triad when played in root position. So after that first flat 6th, just noodle around diatonically, and then just climb up the arpeggio of the harmony you're on and repeat all that noodling an octave higher. All three groups of triplets do this without fail. Now, on that risky ascent, on the way out of the woods, the rule is this. Step up the triad of the harmony that you're on, but use chromatic lower neighbors on each. Now that might seem like a lot to remember, but each of these rules actually depends on the other rules, so they start reinforcing each other when you begin to analyze the passage. So between this analysis and other practice techniques, you're very unlikely to get lost, but there's still some irregularities about the passage that could potentially trip you up. But the point is, when you've analyzed the logic behind most of the notes, the irregular moments will actually become easier to memorize because, well, you know what rule they're not following. Again, just by thinking through it and kind of understanding it intellectually, it's going to feed into your nerves and your muscles when you actually practice the thing, and baby's not going to forget. Now, one last observation about this passage. It has a real pregnant energy to it, hypnotizing even.
This is what one musicologist says about our famous Meno Mosso. The entire passage, short though it is so unexpected in this context that I honestly believe it to reflect the experience of being hypnotized, an experience which had such profound significance for Rachmaninoff in relation to this work. So there it is. It's Nikolai.
Wow.
Never thought
Nikolai
of
Dahl. I never thought. Yes, and it is hypnotic. Yeah, and it's when I say Orientalia, I mean it's a bit like the snake charmer too. So it has this. That's beautiful, actually. I don't know if it's true. I don't even know if I agree. But
it. Doesn't matter if it's true.
It's a beautiful metaphor.